Welcome to this episode of To the Contrary podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. Very fortunate to have my good friend David French joining me this weekend because we have a lot to talk about, David.
Oh, is this going to be Joe Rogan length, Charlie? Are we going to go 3 to 5 hours, somewhere around there?
Does he really go 3 to 5 hours? See, I don't ever listen to that stuff. I
think
know.
It's about 3. I think it's typically around 3. Yeah.
See,
yeah.
I actually go for the shorter ones, but I don't know. I mean, there's different philosophies about podcasts. There are some people who say that, make them short and pithy. Others who say, no, people want to wallow in it. They want to go on for hours and hours. We won't, though. So, okay. So, as I was just telling you, I have a very, very short list. We have the collapse of the law firms, the group chat fallout. You had a fantastic piece about Donald Trump's faith advisor, Paula White. By the way, Laura Loomer back in the White House. We're in a period right now where it is impossible to come up with something too absurd. I mean, there's no, have you thought about this? That if somebody would have said 12 months ago, yeah, Pete Hegseth is going to be the Secretary of Defense, Kash Patel is going to be the FBI director, Tulsi Gabbard will be a director of national intelligence, you would have thought, okay, no, seriously. And Laura Loomer would be choosing who works in the national security agencies, whatever.
I when I was telling people about Trump 2.0, I remember telling people things like, we could have an Attorney General Pam Bondi. Like that was my worst case scenario. I had no idea that Trump, I won't say I had no idea. It was not as big a concern that Trump would nominate somebody like a Matt Gaetz, who was initially choice number one. And I didn't think that he would actually go all Kash Patel and Bongino in the FBI.
Dan Bongino.
I did not know he was going to go with Hegseth and DOD. You knew he was going to have loyalists. You knew he was going to have sycophants. You did not necessarily know he was going to be raiding some of the worst elements of right-wing media to bring them in to run American national security and American law enforcement. And in fact, had I told Trump voters before the election, and including a lot of the Trump voters around me, I'm not talking about the core MAGA people who would have, if I told them, hey, it's going to be FBI Director Kash Patel, they would have celebrated. I'm talking about your more normal Republican voter, the people who actually put him in the White House. And if I said it's going to be FBI Director Kash Patel, they would have said, stop being alarmist. You have Trump derangement syndrome. Trump broke you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I had those, and you think about it, the kinds of people that he's chosen, I mean, they send a couple of messages. Number one, I mean, these are the most slavishly loyal people that you could possibly have. Most of them have no constituency outside of MAGA world. So he, in some ways, he's basically saying, I'm going to surround myself with people who will never push back. That's on one level. The second level is just the pure sort of humiliation of making Republicans in the Senate vote for people like this, that he actually does know how to use humiliation as a cudgel, doesn't he? That I am going to demand such loyalty that I'm going to demand you vote for Pete Hegseth, that you vote for Kash Patel, that you confirm RFK Jr.
So there, Charlie, I'm glad you brought that up right off the jump, because this really helps explain the dynamic of what we've seen. He does relish the public spectacle of bending the knee. And what's interesting to me, one thing that's absolutely fascinating is how he will elevate people who were once his absolute harshest critics to extreme pinnacles of power after
Marco
that.
Rubio.
Rubio, J.D. Vance. I mean, all of my discussions about Trump over 10 years, I have never compared Trump to Hitler. I don't think I've ever done that. J.D. Vance did that, and he's vice president of the United States. And Rubio went after Trump hammer and tongs, it's going to be a humiliation. It's going to be indignity if he becomes president of the United States. And now he's Secretary of State. Charlie, here's my theory. If you're tired of your current job, go bend the knee. And hey, maybe in the latter half of his administration, you could be like Secretary of Treasury or something like that, because he loves that capitulation.
He does.
It is something that he incentivizes it. He's very clever about that. He's very, very clever. We can talk about his incompetence, which is very real. We can talk about his malice, which is very real. but you cannot argue that the man doesn't have super shrewd political instincts. He wouldn't be where he is if he didn't have them. And I think this is one of the shrewdest assessments that he made, was that these people are weak.
Mm-hmm.
If I dominate them and I can establish control, they will, and that by establishing a process that says convert to me and the ceiling is unlimited, you can
Right.
go anywhere you want. I mean,
But
subordinate to
I
him, of
own you
course,
forever,
but I
and
own you forever.
you can never push back. So when you go in, it's all in, right? I mean, it's not just I agree with you on this; it's everything.
Right, right. You know, it's funny. There is this really interesting phenomenon, I think, which gave Republicans an advantage in 2024. It was, you can believe anything. You
Right.
can be anti-vax. You can be pro-vax. You can be pro-Ukraine. You can be anti-Ukraine. You can believe anything as long as you believe one thing in addition, which is Donald Trump is Lord and Master.
Yes.
As long as you say, you put on the red hat, anything else you're free to believe. And,
Right.
you know, at first, here was my mistake, Charlie. My mistake was that condition was going to shrink his tent.
Mm-hmm.
But in reality, it oddly expanded his tent, because the Democrats had more conditions. You know,
Right.
especially the far left of the Democratic Party had
Mm-hmm.
more
Mm-hmm.
conditions. And so, you know, you had this whole population of people who'd been attacked, for example, because their position on, you go through the laundry list of sort of culture war issues, and they found out that I can totally be me as
Mm-hmm.
long as I've got on that red hat, if I just move on over to the other side. And so that was something that I did not assess accurately. I thought that the condition of putting on the red hat and yielding to Trump would be just a bridge too far for quote unquote
Right.
independent thinkers. But what I forgot was the element of both how many quote independent thinkers had been repelled by some of the culture of the left, and then how much people are just basically very, very greedy and ambitious. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you impose a pretty low threshold on them, or at least what appears initially to be a low threshold of acceptance on them, but then you give them sort of an unlimited level of advancement, then you can create a almost culture of sycophancy
Well,
that
and he has.
is unlike almost anything we've ever seen.
Well, it is, and so let's. This gets us into the first topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is the tariffs, because I cannot tell you how many people in the business community assured me, absolutely, Charlie, don't worry about the tariffs. He doesn't really mean the tariffs. He's going to bluff on the tariffs. The tariffs are a negotiating tool, and they seem genuinely shocked when, in fact, he did what he has said he was going to do all along. But what is amazing is again how economically illiterate and politically reckless this is. So give me your take on this. And by the way, I just want to draw the line for people who say that Donald Trump is just your traditional conservative Republican. You just had a Republican president, the same Republican president who switched sides in the Ukraine-Russia war last month, impose a $6 trillion tax increase on American consumers, $6 trillion, which is 3 times the tax increase that we passed in 1942 to pay for World War II. That's adjusted for inflation. So give me your take on what's happening, because the stock market, you and I are talking on Friday, market crashed on Thursday, markets crashed on Friday. Donald Trump had to know that was going to happen, right? And he's doing it anyway.
So the one thing is that Donald Trump had to know it was happening, had to know it would happen. I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I do think that he's so delusional that he thinks that because he declares it, that people, this business community that he believes is incredibly loyal will rally to his side. But also he has so little self-doubt that even the tanking of the stock market isn't going to shake his confidence in himself. It's going to make him believe the stock market's out to get him.
He is a true believer.
Right. But here's what's happening, Charlie. And this is something that I think is really important for people to understand. There's a huge difference between Trump 1.0 and 2.0 in this regard. in Trump 1.0, Trump was in love with tariffs. Trump's been in love with tariffs forever, but he was also surrounded by people who were a lot of traditional establishment Republicans who threw their bodies in front of a lot of his worst instincts. And so, yes, there were tariffs in term 1.0, but they were much more modest, much more modest. So now in Trump 2.0, it's too simple to say he's now surrounded by sycophants. He's surrounded by sycophants who are also weird ideologues, and they have their own worldview and belief system that they are using Trump to facilitate in many ways. So Trump looks at tariffs and says, tariffs are wonderful. Tariffs are great. Tariffs are something that bring us revenue, make us rich, which is all delusional stuff. But he's got this arena, these people around him who they know that tariffs can suppress economic growth. They know that. And that's the point, Charlie. You have a lot of people in this larger orbit who believe things like Americans have too much cheap stuff. Americans are getting miserable because they're too focused on GDP growth and economic growth. They want Americans to have a more simple life. They look back at the 1950s with smaller homes, one breadwinner, less sort of consumer options. And
who believes this? Is this JD Vance?
Some of this is coming from like the far right, the new sort of religious right. You see echoes of it in JD Vance. You see echoes of this in Orrin Cass, and kind of this sort of whole. It's a Republican degrowth movement. Truth be told, and look, I'm the last person to say you need more stuff. Like,
yeah,
I'm a believer in a simpler life in many ways, but that's an argument. That's a moral argument to make. That's a cultural argument. You don't go to America and say we have too much stuff, so I'm going to enact policies that make sure you have less, that constrain your ability to.
This is so different from the Republican message for the last 30 years. I mean, this is so different from the prosperity message in the past. And for it to come from, this is why I think people are having a hard time getting their heads around this, because the Republican Party has been growth at all costs. That's why we cut taxes, right? We cut taxes because we want to create jobs, because we want to, boost the GDP. And now we basically have them making peace with, I don't know, something that if it was coming from a Jimmy Carter, Republicans would, have their hair on fire.
Yeah. Charlie, I don't think people are fully understanding the political realignment and ideological realignment that is unfolding in front of us. And why would they? I mean, 80-90% of Americans really don't pay a lot of day-to-day attention to the news. So they haven't heard or seen a lot of the online commentary from sort of the really ideological corners of the Trump right that are like, you're going to have to take your bitter pill and you're going to have to swallow this bitter pill. But on the other end of it, some of them say greater prosperity, but that what they actually do, again, if you read some of the Orrin Cass stuff, he scorns like GDP growth. That he's like, why are we looking at that as a measure of well-being? They want us to focus on things other than material prosperity as a measure of well-being, which again, that's a great religious and moral and cultural argument that you as a free citizen should be able and should choose maybe to live a simpler life or to have less focus on material goods. It is a terrible policy for a national government to just decide that 330 million people are just too materialistic and too greedy and too focused on wealth and GDP growth. And so we're going to suppress all that, whether you like it or not. And at the end of the day, trust us, you'll like this new lifestyle much better. That is much more what you would hear from sort of the degrowth left, often for, say, environmentalist reasons or egalitarian reasons. We need to be closer together in income, et cetera. And that's why it's interesting, Charlie, why you've seen some of this migration far left to Trumpism. And in the meantime, you have my colleague, Ezra Klein, talking about abundance and talking about growth and talking about prosperity and doing big things. And so it's very hard to kind of wrap your mind around this transition, this realignment. And I think the the American people are going to be a trailing edge indicator of this realignment. The leading edge indicator is what you're seeing happen right now in these policies.
But does this explain Donald Trump? I mean, and the political class, because Trump's been a true believer in tariffs, never been a believer in austerity and lifestyle. This is not Donald Trump saying live with less. He wants everything to be great and the biggest, right, the gaudiest. So number one, he's a true believer, but number two. And I want to talk about this as well because I think this connects to so many other things. This is also a power grab, right? I mean, in my newsletter on Friday, I quoted Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, what a complete idiot, saying, "Let Donald Trump run the global economy." Whoa, you want to talk about a hubris? Run the global economy. And so, what Donald Trump has figured out is, again, finding weaknesses that instead of a market based on free market principles, now it's fear and favor. And he's waffling on the question of negotiation, but basically everybody in the world now, all nations and industries, have to come on bended knee to Mar-a-Lago and say, "Oh, please, Mr. Trump, can you give us some relief? Can we get some exemptions?" And he sits back and he has the world by the short hairs. So not only does it scratch his fetish id for tariffs, but also it is a power grab. And it feeds into the arrogance because he's brought everybody to the knees, the billionaire tech bros, right? When I get to the law firms, media. Why does he not think that now this kind of power extends to the entire economy?
Well, what's interesting, Charlie, is I think that one thing we need to know about like the billionaire tech bros, and one thing we need to know about like the elite law firms, and of course we can talk about this more, is a lot of the people who are very, very, very successful in American life are not exactly what you would call giants of moral courage and stature. They are, in many ways, often extremely smart, extremely shrewd in business. They have, extremely creative and entrepreneurial. Yes, all of those things, and we should respect those things that they're good at. But in reality, they're also very good at bending to the wind, which is one of the reasons why they are so successful. So, if you go back, rewind the clock on the tech bros, for example, in the 20 teens, these guys were some of the, leading progressive voices being hosted at Aspen and all of these places. And then, you put your finger into the wind and it starts to shift and they're like, "Oh, well, Trump has some good ideas." I mean, this is the way business often operates. They bend to the prevailing winds. They are not leaders, they are followers. And so when the winds shift, they shift as well. But here's the mistake Trump is making. The mistake that Trump is making is looking at people like, an Elon Musk who was once on the left, now on the right, or a Mark Zuckerberg once on the left, and now at his inauguration. Same thing with the Google guys and Bezos and all of these people. And he says, "Oh, that's France. That's Canada. That's Germany. That's all of our allies, that they will just bend to me." But it's a different thing when you're talking not to some guy who created a company that has invested sort of all of his personal identity in, and there's a fear that it could be hurt or damaged by the existing American government. We're talking about some of the oldest, proudest, most powerful, in some cases, most powerful nations in world history. And so,
which have their own politics too, right? I mean, they have their own political politics, world, right? Yeah.
And in some cases, their own nuclear umbrella. And so you're looking at them and you're trying to just put them under your thumb. And what you're beginning to see already is these nations are rallying against Trump. I fully expect to see retaliation almost as much as you'll see capitulation. And then look at the stand that Canada took. I mean, if there was ever a mismatch in power between two countries, the mismatch between US and Canada is far greater than the mismatch between Russia and Ukraine, for example. And Canada has stood up. What Donald Trump has done is essentially made Canadians more patriotic than make Canadians more tempted to yield. And so I think what you're going to see over time is that you're going to see like a pebble becomes a landslide. You're going to begin to see a lot of the international community recapturing their own national pride and dignity and confronting Donald Trump and refusing to yield to Donald Trump. And all that is going to be terrible for us, Charlie. It's going to be
Yeah.
terrible for the average American.
Well, and also, I mean, if you're, and I think you're right here that Donald Trump probably thinks, well, you know what, if things get too bad, I will just simply, back off. I'll declare victory, right? I will negotiate. I will do the things that I just said he was going to do. I'm not sure that he has all of those options. Also, um, if he starts doing that, then you're ramping up, you're ratcheting up the uncertainty. And this whole notion that people are going to come and invest in the United States, they're going to make all of these decisions, seems incredibly naive given the fact that he's created a world that is governed by his whim, completely unpredictable. So who's going to decide to invest massive amounts of money based on what they think is the playing field when Donald Trump can change the playing field 5 minutes from now? So I mean, he has created this environment of such uncertainty. I think people were also blown away by just the incredible, I'm sorry to use this word, but the incredible fuckery of the formula, where nobody could figure out exactly what he was doing. It was basically junk science. You end up imposing tariffs on these two islands that have just penguins, but not Russia, not Belarus, not North Korea. Um, it raises questions about not just the recklessness, but about the competence and the understanding of the economy. And I think that seemed to have really rattled the CNBC guys. Even the who thought we have this pro-business president, and now they're going, what the hell?
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that is at work here is there was a lot of frustration in the business community against the Biden administration. There was a
Yeah.
lot of frustration. Inflation was high, spending was
Mm-hmm.
giant. There was a sense often, especially when you talk to some folks who were interacting with the Biden administration on foreign policy and economic policy, that they were arrogant, that they sort of viewed themselves as the smartest people in the room. Biden had sort of these
Yeah.
second FDR kind of ideas. So you had a lot of reason for frustration. And so what happened is the business community began to talk itself into a Trump
Yes.
2.0. And by the time they were halfway into that process of talking themselves into it, they really did not want to hear from people like you or me. They just did
Right.
not want to
No,
hear it
I know. Yes.
because they thought that
I
you
lived
don't
through that.
understand what we're dealing with in the business world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we are saying, got it. I'm the last person to say that the Democrats were getting all of these things right. They were not. There were problems. But to turn around and say that the solution then, to use the John Mulaney sketch, is to put the horse in the hospital is insanity. But they didn't want to hear it because they had been so, by that point, we're very good at rationalization. We human beings, we're just great at rationalization. So they didn't want to hear this. They didn't want to hear how bad Trump was going to be. And why didn't they want to hear it? Because they had memory erased basically, or minimized basically everything that happened after 2019 in the Trump administration. Their sort of view of it was that, oh, the real Trump administration is 2017 to 2019. But we knew that as Trump's first term went on, Trump became more himself with every passing year. And the question is, what was he going to be in 2024? He was in 2025. He was not going to be the guy. It was not going to be the administration in 2017. We all knew it, but unfortunately, they have to experience it. We have to experience it now, in part because they weren't willing to see
Sure.
what was as plain as the nose on their face.
I mean, they misread the man and the moment. And going back to this realignment, there's a lot of the Trumpian base that loves the radicalism, that loves the let's burn it all down. But I think that you had a lot of voters, including in the business community, who thought, no, we're not going to take that literally. He doesn't mean it. That's what he throws out at the rallies when he actually gets into office. And I think this is the thing that I think people need to get their heads around, which is how deeply radical and transformative this administration is. Donald Trump really quite seriously wants to be the most consequential president, I don't know, of the last century. I mean, he wants to be in the league of Ronald Reagan and FDR. and quite frankly, you see the pace of change. I mean, the through line, whether you're talking about, race, gender, deportations, Doge, the universities, law firms, pardons, all of that stuff, they are taking the most of this is not, they're not going for incremental change, are they? I mean, this is a deeply radical administration.
It is it is a deeply radical administration, and in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time.
Right.
So one of the
Maybe
things
ever.
that we're used to is defining radicalism as I'm going to, especially conservatives, right, have been used to defining radicalism as I'm going to enact a sweeping new big government program. So, for example, back in the Obama administration, we would have said the Affordable Care Act was a radical piece of legislation because it was a big, huge, sweeping change in American healthcare. Now, in hindsight, that looks like normal governance compared to I'm going to take Greenland and annex Canada. And, if you're listening and you say, well, David, the Affordable Care Act was legislation, this is just trolling. Guys, we're well past this take him seriously, not literally bullcrap. I mean, how many times do we have to watch him try to do exactly the things he says he wants to do before we're going to actually take him seriously? The reason why you look back at Trump and you go through that seriously, not literally nonsense is because of the way the people who threw their bodies in front of him in the first term. That's why you have that seriously, but not literally frame. You should look at Trump from 2020 on, January 6th on, and understand that the man means what he says, and especially when it's repeated and repeated and repeated. Now, I'm not going to say that in some ways he doesn't just kind of try to throw chum in the water.
Yeah.
But, even the third term stuff, I think that's mostly chum in the water, but I'm going to say mostly because I guarantee you, if you had a guy like John Eastman walk into his office and present him with a position paper that said, Mr. President, this is how you can have a third term, he's going to go, the Constitution gives me a third term, and he'd roll with it. And so this is who he is. He wants maximum power. His version of radicalism isn't so much I'm going to enact a new policy. It's I'm going to conquer new territory.
Well, I don't think this is, completely speculative. Well, I'm sorry, it is completely speculative, but we've seen this happen over and over and over again. And we've talked about this, how ideas that, seemed just absolutely absurd, that were out there on the very, edges of the fever swamp, make their way into the mainstream. And then, out of the mouth of Steve Bannon, they become GOP orthodoxy. And you're absolutely right. And people should watch for this. Because there is going to be that article by John Eastman or somebody like John Eastman that makes this 100%, case.
Yes.
You're going to see it in some of these obscure publications at first, and then they're going to start spreading. And for people who think that Donald Trump is not serious about this, that's naive after what he did with the big lie and what he did with January 6th and his success in making that the Republican standard position. So once he begins making that case, you're going to see MAGA begin to move. And I have very little confidence, I want to get your take on this, in Republicans to stand up against him and say, no. I mean, there's a line here. I don't know. And I guess we always have to ask this question with Donald Trump, who is going to stop him? Because that's what they're asking. They're sitting in the Oval Office and saying, let's try it. Who's going to stop us?
100% right. Here's what I say to people. If you're going to tell me Donald Trump has a line, you bear the burden of proof of demonstrating that at this point.
Right.
If there was, where was the line in 2020? Where was that line? Where was the line when he pardoned and granted clemency to to his violent thugs? Where was the line there?
Beat up cops.
So where was the line when he nominates Kash Patel? Where was where are the lines?
Excellent.
And so
excellent.
This is the thing that keeps coming back to me again and again. Again, in my community, these are people I love, friends. He would not do that, really. Or if you talk about the Senate, no, they would stop that. Would they? The fact that the Senate did not convict him after January 6th, I think tells you everything you need to know. absolutely everything. And the fact that right now, as the stock market is plummeting, and the Republicans in Congress have the absolute ability to stop this nonsense, they can pass a bill tomorrow that rips
Hmm.
the tariff response authority from President Trump. They could do it tomorrow. And it's not even on the table. They're going to wring their hands and then they're going to say, trust Trump, almost like in Trump we trust and instead of in God we trust. And in that circumstance, you really have to ask yourself, at what point will they grow a spine? Because you have to understand every single line that is crossed, the ground is laid before it is crossed. So what we're watching now on the attacks on due process relentlessly, they're laying
Right.
the groundwork for more systematic denial of due process. And by that time, it's going to be received conventional wisdom in the Republican base that due process exists just for criminal gangbangers. Like,
Okay, so this is so alarming. I mean, the success that he has had in delegitimizing one institution after another, his attack on the criminal justice system, on the judiciary, and now on due process, and you see some of these poll numbers among Republicans, and it is genuinely alarming because if you're drawing up a scenario for how do we become an authoritarian nation. And again, I understand that we were accused of Trump derangement syndrome when we talked about this last year. But if you're drawing this up, the loss of belief in the rule of law, the loss of belief in due process, that millions of Americans can see somebody snatched off the street by masked agents of the government and sent off to prison camps in El Salvador without due process, and they look at that and they go, "Yeah, I'm okay with that." That takes us into a dark place, doesn't it, David?
oh, it takes us in a very dark place. Charlie, as right before I logged on, I was working on a column about this attack on due process, and one of the points that I make in the column is that in many
Hmm.
ways, the due process clause is one of the most difficult elements of the Bill of Rights to defend
Hmm.
because there is this perception that due process only benefits criminals, right?
Yes.
There's this perception that due process, and then there's also this perception that I'm never going to need due process. Most,
Right.
middle class, upper middle class Americans
That's
living in
not me.
nice communities, they don't worry about a knock on their door in the middle of the night. And so to defend due process, you really have to appeal to transcendent moral norms, our shared human dignity, that we're all human beings created in the image of God. And it's appealing to that that transcendent moral norm that we preserve the right. And the problem is the Trump administration is attacking that transcendent moral norm because it really does see kind of two tiers of humanity. Tier number one are the Trump supporters. Tier number one are the patriotic US citizens.
Yeah.
And then tier number two is everyone else. And immigrants are tier number three. They're a lower level. And so it is very difficult in that circumstance
Yeah.
because a lot of Americans don't have that like practical sense of why due process is
Right.
good. You have to make that moral argument. How long can we sustain a defense of due process when one of our two political parties, led by a man who has one of the most sycophantic cult-like followings I've ever seen in my entire life, are placing those values, including the notion that we're all human beings created in the image of God, equally worthy of being treated with dignity and respect, when that's under direct assault, when the moral framework of the American experiment is under direct assault, how long will we maintain the legal doctrines of the American experiment?
Okay, so I really wanted to talk to you about this because I think there's so many alarming things that are happening right now. It's hard to pick a target on any given
Oh
day.
gosh.
But the thing that is, I think, in many ways the most alarming, and it's not a top of mind for most people, but it is the acquiescence of these big law firms to Trump, where Trump, goes to these big, and these are billion-dollar law firms, and he issues executive orders targeting them because of their political activity. It seems to me, I want to get your take on this, that these orders are clearly illegal, they're clearly unconstitutional. If the law firms fight back, their chances of victory are, I think, pretty solid. And yet, we have this division. We have some of the law firms that are fighting back on principle. You have Jenner and Block. You have Perkins and Coie. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Perkins Coie, yes.
And then you have some of these big law firms who basically have bended the knee and said, we will provide you with 100 million because of your governmental threat. We will provide your political allies with hundreds of millions of dollars of free legal services. It's breathtaking to me, David. I understand that they are rationalizing this, like we need to do this to protect our businesses.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, do they really understand that they have basically put themselves into receivership to Donald Trump? And so give me your take on this, because and the reason I'm so alarmed is clearly he's going root and branch through the attack of the rule of law, that at a certain point, people like you and me will have a hard time finding a lawyer who would represent us if we are adverse with the government. So your take on all of this?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think that we can console ourselves, Charlie, you and I both know some lawyers who would rather die than yield. So, I feel like there are still people out there who will never, ever yield. But I will say this. Here's how the law firms are rationalizing it, and here's where why they're wrong. So if you talk to, say, someone who's defending Paul Weiss or one of these other firms, they'll say, look, we are under existential threat to our business. We wanted everyone to rally around us. That's what Paul Weiss said in an internal statement. We were ready to sue, but we found out that other law firms were swooping in and trying to get our clients. Other law firms were swooping in and trying to get our lawyers. We were about to die as a firm. And then if you look at the language of the agreement, it's all vague and mushy, and really it doesn't bind us to nearly as much as you think it does. So some of them are actually proud of themselves for negotiating an agreement that they think doesn't really give much away. In truth, the reality is what they've done is they've incentivized Donald Trump to keep doing it, as we're seeing time and time again. And then anytime you take this position like, well, I'm going to yield a little bit, but trust me, I won't yield the whole way. We've seen this movie before, Charlie. That's called the Republican Party, right? Oh, trust us. We'll give in. He's the head of the party, but we're still the same core. We're still this. No, everything falls away. It's this biblical principle. If one indicator that you'll be faithful in a lot is when you're faithful in a little. One indicator of whether you'll be courageous when the chips are really down is if you show courage when things are more, if you show courage when the cost is a little bit less, maybe. But what they've done here is they have shown that they have really no courage at all. And by doing that, by demonstrating yes, it's not just the Republicans who will bend the knee, it's big law. It's not just Republicans will bend the knee, it's the biggest universities in the world.
And that incentivizes more. I mean, this is of course, the other fallacy is they think that somehow this will solve the problem or will make them safer. In fact, as we've seen, it makes this administration more arrogant. And so Columbia yields, and they go after Harvard. Harvard yields. They'll go. There is no end to this, and this is what is so dangerous watching these guys. So I mentioned this to you before we started recording. I am obsessed by this movie that I just watched the other night. Obviously was not a palate cleanser for me. It's about Quisling. It's called Quisling: The Final Days. It's a Norwegian movie. He, of course, was the traitor who aligned himself with Hitler during World War II, betrayed the Norwegian people. And I don't want to give too much away. It's a profoundly intellectually serious movie. The plot is basically a pastor is sent to talk with him in prison after the end of World War II, and to get him to deal with his sins and his betrayal. And I don't want to give too much away. Well, I mean, obviously it's a historical figure, but I think people will find it resonating because of the power of rationalization, that somebody who has betrayed his own country can convince himself that in fact he was the savior, that by collaborating and switching sides, you are actually doing the right thing, that you did what everybody else would do in those circumstances. And you hear it and you see it and you're like, this is a man whose name has become synonymous with treason and betrayal. And yet in his mind, he thinks he didn't do anything wrong. And I won't give away the ending to it, but the pastor is trying to say, look, we all make mistakes, we all sin. Maybe at the end of your life, could you acknowledge this? But it's so hard for people to do that. But this power of rationalization, the power of saying that even though I have done this terrible thing, I did this terrible thing to prevent some other terrible thing from happening, and then there's no break on the way down. So that's my movie take of the day. Okay, so we're only like a week and a half away from Signalgate, and I wanted to get your take on this. This is the group chat. Now, I still think that scandal has legs, but now I'm starting to think, is this the same old naivete that we've had over the last 10 years? We think, but this time it's going to be different because, again, we're a week and a half away and there's no investigation. There doesn't appear to be any fallout. No one has lost their job. And it was one of the most egregious breaches that anyone can remember. So where are we at on that, David? Did they get away with that? Did that just pass? Did that pass too?
Did they get away with that? Mostly yes, but with the qualifier, not entirely yes. I think the one way to think about each one of these individual instances is to remember that Donald Trump lost once before. He lost in 2020. And why did he lose in 2020? It was not any one thing. It was not any sort of one scandal. It was an accumulation of a sense of chaos, a sense of disorder that led just enough, peeled off just enough. And by November 2020, just enough was millions of people,
right,
to where he lost decisively in the popular vote. And so what is happening now is we're beginning to see a kind of what I think is an accelerated version of that process. Yes, he came in with more goodwill than he came into after the 2020 election. In 2016 election, he came in with less goodwill than he did after the 2024 election, but he's squandering it at a pretty significant rate. And
accelerated chaos.
And the reason why, and the interesting difference between this scandal and other scandals is the Signal scandal really only got kicked off the front page because of a greater problem, which was the collapse of the stock market. I saw a statistic on Thursday that the losses on Thursday were one of the top 30 worst days in the stock market's history out of all of the days in the stock market. And so when you look at it like that, that would knock the Signal chat scandal off the front page. But I'll tell you why it's going to still be relevant. It's going to still be relevant because that was a leading edge indicator of the total incompetence of this national security team.
Yeah.
Now, that's not going to say that I'm going to disagree with everything they do. I do agree that we should be attacking the Houthis, for example, to open up shipping in the Red Sea. But this is a leading edge indicator of what's to come. And just to tell people a bit about the gravity of what they did, I'm a former JAG officer, Army lawyer, and if any officer in the United States military had done the same thing that Pete Hegseth had done, this would be the process. They would be instantly relieved of command or relieved of their duties if they weren't in a command position, instantly. The next thing they would be told is they need to get a lawyer instantly. And they might even be taken into immediate custody pending a further investigation because there would be probable cause that a crime had been committed. And so this is what would happen to an ordinary service member. And Pete Hegseth does what would get Captain Hegseth immediately thrown out of the military, and Secretary of Defense Hegseth just rolls forward doing push-ups with the troops. And you do not build an effective military through lack of accountability. If there's anything we know from military history, you do not build an effective military through lack of accountability. And yet that's what they're trying to do. And the only accountability they impose, Charlie, really, truly so far is political. purging people politically. So that's what the Russian military does. That's what totalitarian militaries do. The American military is a professional military. It does not purge people for politics. It will purge for corruption or poor performance, but not politics. Here we see corruption and poor performance protected, and political purges underway. That's the reverse of the military culture.
Well, also speaking of purges, I mean, you can't make any of this stuff up. So none of the people involved in that chat have lost their jobs. But just the last couple of days, we found out that Laura Loomer, who is one of the nuttiest, most extreme, freaky conspiracy theorists on the planet, apparently got an Oval Office meeting with Donald Trump and convinced him to fire a bunch of NSC officials because of their lack of loyalty. So not only are we doing political purges, but we're doing political purges urged by one of the most toxic, there's nothing I can say that comes close to actually capturing how loony Laura Loomer is. Let's put it this way. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene thinks that she's a crackpot and a bigot. I mean, that gives you some indication.
Yeah, this person, again, Charlie, it's so hard to approach. It's very difficult to communicate how wacky this administration is, because everything has a deep backstory. And so Laura Loomer is no exception. There's a whole Laura Loomer extended universe of weirdness and scandals, right? And so it's sort of a take your own pick. Here's what I did to one of my friends who was saying, what's the big deal? Presidents fire people all the time for political alignment. I said, and this is somebody who's like a volume user of Chat GPT. And I said, I don't really have time to explain it. Just ask Chat GPT, why do people believe Laura Loomer is a racist? Just ask that question. And about 3 minutes later, I get a response. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Now I get it.
I'm going to do this as soon as we get off, by the way, because
I did it before I asked him just to see what it would say. And it wasn't even complete. It wasn't even everything. But if you were going to just say, imagine the wackiest MAGA conspiracy theorist you've ever met in your life.
Right.
Double it, add racism, and that's Laura Loomer.
It is. We don't have too much time left, but you did a great piece. Speaking of like nut jobs in the White House, we've talked about the crisis of evangelical Christianity and their embrace of Donald Trump, but this is like in a whole different level of that. Paula White, who is his spiritual advisor, who is regarded as a heretic by a lot of the evangelical Christians who support Donald Trump. And yet, just give me the thumbnail profile of Paula White, who is one of these crazy figures who has Donald Trump's ear.
Yeah, the reason I was writing about Paula White is because she had just put out put out to her followers a message that she was going to be able to bless them with 7 supernatural blessings, among them an angel to guard over you and protect you, that God would make your enemies his enemies, which is a weird thing to say to people, right?
Big if true.
Big if true. So 7 supernatural blessings, including health, prosperity, an angel, God wreaking havoc on your enemies. Oh, and a Waterford crystal cross for your home, all for the low offering of $1,000 or more. And that was an occasion for me to sort of remind people that some of the evangelical support for Trump is not a mystery at all. Mm-hmm. Some of it is and has been for a while, but some of it is not a mystery at all. And it's the people who come from this tradition, which is called the independent charismatic movement, that has one foot in what's called the prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel teaches you that if you have the right kind of bold faith, then you can have health and wealth. That's part of it. It also teaches you that you're destined to rule. It also, I was talking earlier about this 2-tiered vision of humanity. It creates this 2-tiered vision of humanity. There's those who are saved and those who are under the influence of demons and Satan. And so you really have sort of the righteous and the demonic. I mean, really, that is the breakdown. And these people who were very prominent before Trump, mind you, these are people, pastors, mega church pastors who have private jets. They have giant mansions. They revel in their wealth in front of their congregations. They're extremely authoritarian to their congregations, saying that they have a divine anointing from God to lead, and that if you contradict them, you are essentially defying God. And so the thing that I
Jeez.
began to realize is in this culture, this Christian subculture, again, not all of it, this is a minority culture, but deeply influential in MAGA America. When they saw Trump, they weren't seeing somebody who was that different or even different at all from the pastors that they love. Now, he's obviously quite different from your median Southern Baptist or Presbyterian pastor who lives a modest middle-class life and is serving their family and their community faithfully. Donald Trump is 1 billion% different from that person. And that's where that evangelical support gets more mysterious and difficult to explain. But for another faction, when they saw that kind of ostentatious wealth, that delusions of grandeur, that authoritarian mindset, the hatred of enemies, he looks just like their pastor. So it's not a contradiction of their beliefs. It's an extension of their beliefs.
Oh, gosh. Okay. So I would strongly urge people to read your column about Paula White, because this is one of those things where if you're not familiar with this tradition, it just sounds so crazy. I'm sorry. It just, if all you know about Christianity is what you might have read in the New Testament, this will have no relationship to it whatsoever.
It will
it
blow
is so bizarre.
your mind.
Which, again, David, thank you so much for joining me. And this is one of the reasons why we do this podcast, because more than ever, we need to remind ourselves that we